Hello everyone. Today we are extremely honoured to have with us Professor Sir Tom Devine to deliver an address to the University of Glasgow 2020 history graduates. Professor Devine scarcely needs an introduction, having had a very varied and immensely successful career spanning over 50 years, and his research and writing has revolutionised the way Scotland views her own history. Professor Devine started his career at the University of Strathclyde as an assistant lecturer in 1979, before moving on to become a Professor of Scottish History in 1989 and eventually becoming Vice Principal of the University. A change followed in 1998 when he took up the role of the inaugural Director of the Research Institute of Irish and Scottish Studies at the University of Aberdeen, and in 2005 he ascended to the pinnacle of the history profession in Scotland when he was appointed to the Sir William Fraser Chair of Scottish History and Paleography, where he remained until his retirement in 2015. Throughout his career, his work has illuminated Scotland's role in the British Empire, the origins and expansions of the global Scottish diaspora, and in his most celebrated work, he chronicled the social, political and economic development of the modern Scottish nation. More recently, his work has become the centre of debate as Scotland grapples with its role in the slave trade. Sir Tom was knighted in 2014 for his services to Scottish history and has been a key policy advisor to multiple Scottish governments. Today, he remains research active and is widely recognised as Scotland's leading historian. Professor Devine, welcome and thank you from all the 2020 history graduates and the University of Glasgow History Society for joining us today.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Nathan, for those generous, very generous introductory remarks. I'm actually delighted and indeed honoured to be invited by the Glasgow University History Society to address and congratulate indeed this year's history graduates at the university. And I'm thinking now of not simply those in single honours, but those in joint honours, and also, of course, those who have graduated with other degrees of which history is a part. The first thing I want to do, of course, having thanked you for the invitation, is to give you my warm congratulations. You all now have a degree in a rigorous academic discipline, universally respected from a world-class university and from a department that I know from the people who work in it is a centre of excellence for research study in the discipline. And I say that as a professor at the University of Edinburgh, and I don't say it through clenched teeth either. The second thing I want to say is to give you my commiserations for the fact that, like other universities in the UK and indeed worldwide, you won't be able, at least at the moment, to experience the joy of the graduation ceremonial, the pride that would give your parents and friends. But of course, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to celebrate, and I'm sure you have celebrated when your results come through. My understanding is that the university will do its damnedest to ensure that at some point you will go through a graduation ceremony. The final thing I want to say is that in the final, or at least in the second or third part of my presentation or my remarks today, I want to answer some questions that the members of the board of the History Society have, a couple in particular. And then that will allow me that will trigger in me, hopefully, some thoughts that may be of relevance to you as now graduates of the discipline in history, either after a 4-year course or a 3-year course for the ordinary degree. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very generous remarks, Professor. We are certainly very grateful to have had you here today. And a question I believe is most prescient in the minds of many present history graduates and undergraduates is, what do you think at its core is the value of an actual history degree?
Well, thank you for that. That's obviously, it is not only a vital question, but is relevant to anyone who's undergone undergraduate history training, and particularly those who have just completed that education. I've got a bad habit of referring in media interviews and in presentations like at book festivals and generally in public discourse, referring to history as the queen of all disciplines. This is partly to annoy those in the so-called STEM subjects like science, engineering, medicine, etc., who sometimes have a glorified view of the significance of what they practice. But that's just a humorous aside, because I truly believe that at its best, the undergraduate history degree in UK universities, and not least in an excellent institution like the University of Glasgow, provides a first-class, rounded education. And so what are its kind of hallmarks of that rounded education? It seems to me that universities, although this is no longer the case in general, universities should be about training in systematic thought and reflection. The creation, if you like, or the attempted creation or development, obviously it cannot always happen, of the independent mind, of a sense of judgment on materials in the past, where there are gaps, where there are ambiguities in the evidence, and the like. But the actual training of the critical mind, or the evolution of that particular mindset, is vitally important, above all, in terms of what I regard as education, rather than training. And the signal aspect of a history degree is it confronts the undergraduate with the complexity of human development in the past. And it challenges those undergraduates who the questions are asked in examinations, in essays, in tutorial seminars, etc., to express their view in a cogent, reasoned, systematic, controlled use of language. Hopefully, the oral presentation or the essay or the seminar paper will also be to the point, because irrelevance and flannel is one of the great enemies of historical discourse. And at the same time, all of this should be presented, at least at its peak of excellence, in clear, straightforward, easily understood, and direct, and sometimes even, hopefully, incisive English prose. One of my historical heroes is the long dead great French historian Marc Bloch. He, known as the co-founder of the Annales School, which helped to transform historical study not only in France but eventually globally, but also a résistant in his later years. And for that, he was executed by the Gestapo in 1944. Partly he's glorified because of that sacrifice for France, mort pour la France, as they say in the memorials, but also because he's had a long distance, and that generation of his, like Lucien Febvre, Emmanuel Roy-Ladurie, and others, have had a cogent and very significant effect on professional historical study. And in terms of my last remark, despite the formidable corpus of work that he's contributed to thinking about history and to medieval history in particular of France, he said that historical works should be able to be understood, by the citizen. Not necessarily simply the specialist, but by a person wishing to find out about the past and how we came to be the way we are today. And I would hope that because of its jargon-free nature, I would hope that the way modern undergraduate historians are taught in our universities should be to present history in that particular way. It is probably nowadays the only discipline, and I include in that the other humanities disciplines and the social science disciplines, where we still teach our students, I think, hopefully at least, to write in clear prose and to come to judgmental or come to judgment statements at the end, which bear a close relationship between the dynamic of the essay or the oral presentation and the concluding remarks. So therefore, if you then move on from the fascination, which I'm sure anybody who wants to study history must have about the human condition in the past, it's if you like, it's the laboratory of scholars, whether they're historians or not, who want to understand the human condition and the way it's evolved. But if you move on to that, to the future, as to what you might do in the future, one of the clear advantages, and I'm not now talking about what you might do in the immediate future, I'm talking about your lifetime as an educated person. I'm also talking about the fact that given the nature of global economic development, flexibility must be at the core of the occupations of the future. There will be movement between each. And that, ironically enough, enhances the historical, and I don't want to use the word training, the historical education and the values that are at its core. That enhances it over highly specialized and specific disciplines, which of course have not necessarily been the product of high-level training, but have not been necessarily the product of rounded education in the traditional humanistic sense. So my sense is, and I could hopefully, if I was able to have the time, talk about this for a very long number of hours, but in a nutshell, that is what I would say if somebody asked me, as you may well be asked at interviews, because the curiosity is, despite what I consider to be an excellent education, you will get employers or potential employers who will ask you to defend, why did you study history? Nonsense. You would never have been asked that 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I've given you something in the way, or at least of a partial answer to that skeptical question.
Professor, thank you for a most erudite and comprehensive answer. On the points of critical thinking in universities, some of our most critical minds who are graduating will be thinking of going into academia themselves. How did you go about your own undergraduate teaching in history, and how can they make their teachings understood by the citizen?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. I mean, it's very appropriate for me because, if you like, I'm in the last phases, not simply of my career, but possibly also of my life. I graduated with first-class honours in social and economic history in 1968. 1969, really because there were very few trained historians available at that time. In 1969, the first year of my doctorate, I was lucky enough to be employed by my alma mater, my own university. And then I worked in universities, in fact, worked in 3 universities from that date until 2015. To my horror, if my arithmetical calculation is correct, that's around 46 years, which must be surprising to some of the great new graduates of this year at Glasgow University. So the way I taught students, especially, obviously I had graduate students and I had research assistants and research fellows. But in terms of the focus on undergraduate education and the way I approached it, the first thing, and I'm sure any of you who go into teaching will do the same, My story is one of evolution. At the very beginning, such was my, because remember I was only 22, 23 at the time, such was my shyness, my introversion, if you will, in addressing undergraduates, particularly in the lecture format, that I hardly ever raised my head and made eye contact with them. By the time I reached, just before I became a professor, this would be 1987, I had cast aside all notes, and I've never used notes since that date until the end of my career. And of course, when I'm giving public presentations, it's exactly the same approach. So you evolve. So the first thing, I mean, if I can divide it into two parts in terms of the answer. The first part, of course, is the lecture, the traditional presentation by a scholar of a particular field or area in which he or she would claim a degree of expertise. And the second area, which you'll all be used to and accustomed to in the last few years, is the tutorial or the seminar. So first of all, the lecture. The lecture is a very convenient way, and it's still not been usurped to this day in universities, of providing, if you like, a slab of information and material. Often that today is given in the form of PowerPoint presentations. I am not only an academic handloom weaver, I'm also to some extent an academic Luddite. I have never used PowerPoint, I've never used technology in any of my presentations since my first appointment, going on now until the year 2020. My view of a lecture is it should provide certainly information, but it should also stimulate, intrigue, and cause the audience, you know, especially at those points where you, in the French phrase, you try and provide some aperçu, some insights that they wouldn't necessarily always find in the book, or some intriguing point of evidence which takes them slightly by surprise. And of course, at the same time, also leavened by humor. Because some of the stuff we discuss in terms of understanding the past is open to the odd smile or even sometimes gales of laughter. Why should that not be? After all, we are not teaching mathematics. So the attempt, whether it succeeds or not, as far as the lecture format is concerned, is inspiration, surprise from time to time about what is said or the evidence that's used. And often I use my own research evidence, especially in the more specialized courses, as many of your own lecturers will have done as well, not yet in print, in other words. And the other aspect, which is extremely important, is the scholar should present to, if you like, the neophyte audience, the undergraduate audience, the way a structured analysis of a particular question or theme in history should be dealt with. In a sense, because of the experience that that person has, a model of the way that their thinking should be cast, their mindset should develop when they're writing their own essays or giving their own oral presentations. And then secondly, there is the tutorial, the seminar. And I know certainly compared to my day, seminars and tutorials are now inevitably increased in size as we've moved towards a mass higher education system. But when I started university teaching, you were literally talking about 3 or 4 or 5 people in a room discussing a particular problem. And of course that then developed up to maybe seminar groups of maybe between even as large as 15 or 20, and some might even have the experience of even bigger numbers, than that. The vital part of the seminar and the vital part then of marking of essays and of tutorial papers that may have derived from the seminar question is when the real effort of the teacher is to inculcate independent thinking, the challenging of orthodoxy, to encourage the clash of opinion, so as that different perspectives may emerge in the course of the discussion. I mean, I used to do things that would not be allowed today. If a student or a couple of students were ready for that kind of give and take intellectually, well, they'd be gently asked to leave the room and come back the following week or the following fortnight. Probably, if I did that nowadays, an undergraduate tutorial, I would be in deep difficulty with the powers that be in the university system. So the role, at least this is the way I saw it, the role of the tutor is to ensure engagement of all, participation of all, but importantly and crucially, to encourage thinking or rethinking about orthodoxy and pat answers, really to demonstrate the difficulty we have as scholars of coming to generalizations or conclusions given the evidence that is before us. Historical evidence, unlike evidence in a court of law, is horrendous. It's enormously rich in some areas and enormously limited in other areas. If it's rich, the challenges are as great as they are, say, in the early medieval period, when they may be more limited. Because the sheer scale and depth and richness of the evidence means that the undergraduate has got to use discrimination in order to get to the heart of the question or questions that's being asked of him or her. And so that is why the task of writing the essay, of giving the tutorial presentation, and of discussion, and hopefully, if you can manage it, discussion which eventually means that the tutor vanishes into the woodwork and lets you all get on with it. So in terms of these two modes of university teaching that I have certainly practiced during my career, the descriptors I have given are, if you like, the models. And I can assure you and your own university teachers that it doesn't necessarily always happen. It doesn't always happen in practice that things develop as they do. But I mean, as a professor of history, and in my case, a professor of Scottish history, much more than the simple challenge of the job was the challenge of ensuring that at every single meeting with undergraduate, graduate students, and the research fellows and research assistants I have worked with in the past, your aim must be to achieve excellence. And that is what also I would hope for and expect from my students. While at the same time understanding that there's also got to be at least a modicum of gentleness involved in the process. Thank you.
Professor Devine, thank you very much for your insights on teaching. I know for a fact that what you've mentioned here will be beneficial to future academics and also to undergraduates like myself, especially when it comes to things like proper preparation. One of the things you're renowned for in the historical sphere, Professor Devine, is your work on the, quite frankly, horrific institution of slavery and Scotland's own role in that. Now, much is being done in Britain and indeed the world today to confront this legacy. And much of that is being done by the general population with regards to things like the pulling down of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. Yeah. If it's not too much hassle, could you perhaps give your own perspective on this?
Well, the first thing is, it's as an historian, if I can answer it in those terms rather than simply as a citizen of the country. As an historian, I think it's obviously excellent that for whatever reason, and the reasons, of course, we all know about, and they're horrendous to do with certain incidents in the USA, in terms of triggering Black Lives Matter. It's been good in Scotland because although, as you probably know, there have been significant advances made in maybe the last 5 to 10 years in what was tabula rasa before, which was a blank page before, in terms of the nation's involvement in slavery. I mean, the irony is, of course, that direct slave trading on the part of Scottish merchants after circa 1740 was almost non-existent. The impact of slavery in our country, and I have argued in print that the impact was great in an essay published some time ago called Did Slavery Make Scotia Great? ? The impact of slavery in Scotland was through trade commodities which were based and could not have developed but for slavery, and also because of the activities of Scottish men, because there were overwhelmingly men in the plantation economy. There's been a lot of, with the great interest that's developed, there's also been a lot of nonsense. And I'm not in any sense accusing the citizenry of the country or the media of the country for not having the kind of expertise or grip on a topic that trained historians had by virtue of their profession. But perhaps what I would have liked to have seen, in addition to the role of activists, would have been a much greater penetration of the discourse by my colleagues. I'm not denying that some of them haven't stood up to be counted, but I would like to have seen more evidence of those who are professionally trained in the subject and know what the evidence is to come forth and disseminate it. And I can assure you, in my experience, particularly in relation to the Scottish media, and even indeed the British media, they're always very open to having scholars give their point of view on a question which is controversial. The age of the expert, in other words, is not yet dead. In terms of the statue issue and the renaming of streets, particularly in Glasgow, that date from the tobacco and sugar area, I'm totally opposed to that personally, because I regard it as a form of censorship of the past, of obliterating what had been, and as part of our own organic development, if you like, as a nation. I am completely committed, on the other hand, to having these issues dealt with thoroughly in not only undergraduate studies, but also in the school curriculum. And I'm also very committed to seeing, if you like, public display, as I would refer to it in a more general sense, public display that would appeal to people who won't necessarily want to spend the time reading an historical tome. And here I'm thinking about museums, I'm thinking about galleries, I'm thinking also about particular events, whether at book festivals or whatever. And as far as the city in which your own university is situated, it's almost a scandal that there still hasn't been any public announcement about the creation of either a gallery or museum dedicated to Scotland and Empire, in which slavery would be a subset, or a museum dedicated to slavery itself. I would prefer to see the former, because we need to see the big picture in order to understand how chattel slavery, the most horrible form of slavery, managed to flourish in the 17th and 18th and early 19th centuries, and ironically enough, helped to shape the modern Scottish nation as we know it today, particularly in terms of its impact on the great economic leap forward of the 18th and early 19th centuries.
If I may ask a question relating to what I think perhaps is your most well-known, successful work, The Scottish Nation. Reading it, one of the things I was struck by was just how dramatically Scotland was transformed in the period covered by the book, 1700 to 2000, and just how familiar a lot of the situations in the book were to people who live in Scotland today. So I was wondering, was the idea in writing the book a way to bridge the gap between the historical Scotland of the popular consciousness, which tends to be Wallace, Bruce, the medieval kingdom, and the modern Scotland that most Scottish people would recognise?
Absolutely. It was the very first volume I attempted, which was meant to stand up to the review and response of my peers, my academic peers, but also at the same time would have appeal to a much wider audience. So the challenge was not in the research, because most of the research that my own research that I incorporated in it was also had previously been in the public domain through the essays and other books and articles that I'd written, and of course also the compendium of views of other scholars. But the challenge was in ensuring that an historian, a trained scholarly historian, was able to bridge or go across that bridge from the academy, if you like, from niche historical writing, in order to make an impact on the general public. Now, whether or not that was achieved or not, whether or not that was accomplished in every possible scintilla, and my publisher Penguin have recently told me that the book has now sold 100,000 copies. But it had to rise to the twin challenge of being acceptable in research and scholarly terms by the peers, and then of course having something to say to a wider readership. I wrote it at a time of family tragedy. I wrote it in memory of the son I had lost age 21. A year before I obtained a sabbatical, I'd just finished my stint as deputy principal at Strathclyde. So that was a very powerful impetus. I finished the book actually, which is not a small one, in about a year or less. It was about 8 to 9 months. And I think that was partly because I was writing for John. As the Gaelic says at the beginning of the book, Aidfulchnis, now at peace. And the other thing, of course, which was galvanizing it, was the general political situation in Scotland. There was no up-to-date modern history of the Scottish people. You know, the great one before, which also inspired me, as it did so many other scholars, Chris Spout's Scottish People. It was published the year after I graduated in the first degree in 1969. But there had been a treasure trove of new research done, because Scottish history, and particularly modern Scottish history, was really born in the 1960s. I often quote the statement made by Professor John Hargreaves when he was elected to the Burnett Fletcher Chair of Modern History at the University of Aberdeen, and that was in 1964. And he stressed or argued, quote, "The modern history of Scotland is less studied than the history of Yorkshire." And that is pretty close to the truth, despite the fact that there was the beginnings of a squad of talented historians emerging at the time. So the golden age, if you want to call it that, or really the first age of modern Scottish historical writing in the modern era, the post-1700 era, as it were, came in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the early 90s. Hardly any of that massive portfolio of research was known to the general public. So that was the second major impetus, especially since it was clear that things were beginning to happen of an historical nature in the political sphere. And of course, the book was published in the very year that the Scottish Parliament was established.
Thank you very much, Professor Devine, for your inspiring words today, and to the class of 2020, congratulations.